The early morning sun filtered through the grand arched windows of the University of Pennsylvania's lecture hall, casting a warm glow over the rows of students settling into their seats. Among them sat Barron Trump, his posture composed, his black suit impeccably pressed. He was known more by reputation than by presence, a quiet genius who rarely sought attention but commanded it effortlessly when he spoke. At the front of the room, Dr. Richard Lawson adjusted his tie and stepped toward the podium. A respected professor of advanced calculus, he had built a name not only for his intellect but also for his strong ideological stance. His lectures often veered beyond numbers and equations into the realm of societal critique, much to the quiet discomfort of some students. Today, however, the tension was more palpable than usual. Instead of the usual mathematical formulas scribbled across the whiteboard, a bold statement stood in their place, questioning the role of mathematics in the broader academic landscape. A murmur rippled through the lecture hall. Some students exchanged glances, while others sighed, already anticipating what was to come. Dr. Lawson cleared his throat. Mathematics, he began, while undeniably valuable, must not overshadow the broader issues shaping our society. Numbers exist in a vacuum, but we do not. Our curriculum should reflect that. The air in the room grew heavier as students processed his words. Some nodded in agreement, but others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Among them, Barron Trump remained motionless, his face unreadable. Then, slowly, he raised his hand. The movement was subtle but commanded attention. Heads turned. Even Dr. Lawson hesitated for a fraction of a second before acknowledging him. Yes, Mr. Trump. The professor's tone carried a mix of curiosity and mild irritation. Barron's voice was calm, deliberate. Professor, most of us enrolled in this course to deepen our understanding of calculus. Would shifting the focus away from mathematics not disadvantage all students, regardless of their background? A few students exchanged glances. The challenge was polite yet firm. Dr. Lawson's expression tightened, his eyes narrowing slightly. You believe mathematics should remain untouched by the reality of privilege and systemic bias? Barron held his gaze. I believe mathematics is one of the few things that remains unbiased. It does not ask for our politics, only our understanding. A near silence fell over the room. Some students sat up straighter, sensing that something was about to unfold. Dr. Lawson exhaled through his nose, a smile creeping onto his lips, though it was not one of amusement. Interesting perspective, he said. Perhaps you'd be willing to put your theory to the test. Without waiting for a response, he turned to the whiteboard and, with practiced ease, began writing out a complex multivariable calculus problem, the kind of equation designed to crush even the brightest minds. He capped the marker and turned back to Barron. Since you are so passionate about academic excellence, let's see if you can uphold it. A hush fell over the room. The challenge had been set. Barron, however, did not waver. Instead, he rose from his seat, his expression unreadable. Without hesitation, he walked toward the front of the class, his stride measured, unhurried, as if the weight of the moment barely registered. He reached the whiteboard, marker in hand, and studied the equation in front of him. Behind him, the tension among the students was tangible. Some leaned forward in their seats, while others exchanged nervous glances. Even those who had never paid much attention to Barron before now found themselves captivated by the unspoken battle unfolding between student and professor. Dr. Lawson, standing off to the side with arms crossed, exuded quiet confidence. He had chosen this equation deliberately. It was not just difficult, it was beyond the scope of anything he had taught in class, a problem designed to humiliate, not to test knowledge. Whenever you're ready, Mr. Trump, the professor said, his voice laced with condescension. Barron did not answer immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, examining the equation as if it were a puzzle rather than a trap. The pause stretched just long enough for murmurs to grow louder. Finally, He turned to Dr. Lawson, his voice even and composed. "I noticed there are multiple approaches to solving this," Barron said. "Would you prefer I use the standard method? Or would you be interested in a more efficient solution I learned while studying Euler's original papers?" The room went completely still. Dr. Lawson's smirk faltered. "You've read Euler's original work?" "In German," Barron replied simply. "The translations often miss the elegance of his methodology." A whisper rippled through the students. Emily Carter, a quiet but observant student, leaned toward Jacob Lee, a scholarship student watching intently. "Did he just say he's read Euler's original papers?" she whispered. Jacob nodded slowly, eyes still fixed on Barron. "In German." Dr. Lawson's expression darkened. "Well then," he said, forcing a smile, "let's see if your knowledge extends beyond theory." Barron turned back to the board. Marker poised. The class collectively held its breath as he began to write. The first few steps were straightforward, logical. But as Barron progressed, his approach diverged from the expected path. Instead of brute force calculations, his method was fluid, almost artistic. He bypassed unnecessary complexity with elegant shortcuts, transforming what had seemed like an insurmountable equation into something shockingly simple. The silence in the room deepened. Even students who had struggled with calculus before could follow his reasoning, could see the clarity in his approach. Dr. Lawson, however, was no longer watching with the same smug confidence. His brow furrowed as he traced the steps Barron had taken. Barron paused briefly, turning back toward his professor. "This is the traditional approach," he said, gesturing toward the nearly completed solution. "But there's a more elegant way using Louville's insights. Would you like to see that as well?" A new tension entered the room. This was no longer a student proving his knowledge. This was a student offering his professor a lesson. Dr. Lawson clenched his jaw. "Continue," he said. His voice clipped. Barron nodded and resumed writing. The new method unfolded even faster than the first, bypassing unnecessary steps, cutting straight to the heart of the equation. When he finished, he stepped back and capped the marker. Two solutions, both correct, both complete, stood before the class. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, from the middle of the hall, Emily Carter raised her hand. Her voice was quiet but steady. Could you explain that last step again?" she asked. "It actually helps with the chapter we covered last week." Barron turned to her with a slight smile. "Of course," he said. "I'd be happy to." Dr. Lawson's jaw tightened. This was not the outcome he had anticipated. This was not supposed to be a learning moment, it was supposed to be a lesson in humiliation. And yet, the students were no longer looking at him. They were looking at Barron. For the first time since he had started teaching, Dr. Lawson realized he had lost control of his own classroom. The murmurs in the lecture hall gradually died down as students exchanged glances, their eyes darting between the whiteboard and their notebooks. Emily Carter, who had been diligently jotting down notes, stared at Barron Trump's solutions with wide-eyed realization. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing a part of calculus she had never quite grasped before. Beside her, Jacob Lee, a scholarship student who had spent countless nights wrestling with similar equations, studied Barron with something akin to admiration. At the front of the room, Dr. Richard Lawson remained frozen. The quiet arrogance he had worn just moments ago had been replaced with something far less certain. Irritation flickered across his face, but beneath it lay an unmistakable glimmer of recognition. He had underestimated the student standing before him, and worse, he had done so publicly. The professor cleared his throat, attempting to reclaim authority. "Well," he said, forcing a tight smile, "it's certainly an impressive display. But solving an equation doesn't invalidate the broader discussion of systemic advantages in education. Would you not agree, Mr. Trump?" Barron turned to face him, his posture still composed. "I don't believe anyone here is arguing against acknowledging privilege where it exists," he said evenly. But I do believe that diluting academic rigor does not solve inequality, it only diminishes opportunities for everyone." Murmurs rippled through the room. Some students nodded in agreement, while others exchanged uncertain glances, waiting to see how the professor would respond. Dr. Lawson's lips pressed into a thin line. "And you believe your personal background hasn't given you any advantages?" Barron tilted his head slightly. "Of course. I've had opportunities others haven't. I'd be a fool to deny that. But the solution isn't to lower the bar, it's to ensure that everyone has the tools to reach it." A pause. Then, from the middle of the hall, a voice broke the tension. "That actually makes sense." All eyes turned toward Jacob Lee, who rarely spoke in class. His voice was steady, though quieter than Barron's. "I mean, I've had to work twice as hard as some of my classmates just to keep up. But I didn't come here expecting things to be easier, I came here because I wanted to prove I could do it." More murmurs of agreement followed. Dr. Lawson's expression darkened as he realized the conversation was slipping further out of his control. Before he could respond, the door to the lecture hall swung open. Dean Thomas Whitaker entered, his presence commanding immediate attention. A tall man known for his pragmatic approach and political caution, he had long mastered the art of navigating academic tensions. "Dr. Lawson," the dean began, his voice measured, "we need you for an emergency faculty meeting regarding the upcoming curriculum changes." The professor exhaled slowly, seizing the opportunity for an exit strategy. "Of course," he said, turning toward the door. Then, as an afterthought, he glanced back at Barron. "It seems we'll have to continue this discussion another time." But before he could take a step, Barron spoke again. "Professor, you challenged me to solve this problem in front of everyone," he said, his voice calm yet unwavering. "Leaving now would teach an unfortunate lesson about academic integrity." The air in the room shifted. Students exchanged glances, sensing something unprecedented was happening. Dean Whitaker raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by the unfolding confrontation. Dr. Lawson hesitated, caught between retreat and his own pride. "Young man," the dean said carefully, addressing Barron, "are you suggesting that your professor is avoiding his own challenge?" Barron met his gaze without flinching. "I'm simply stating that if academic merit is truly what we value, then it should apply to everyone, professors included." A ripple of whispers spread through the class. Some students reached for their phones, already recording. Dr. Lawson's jaw tightened. "And what exactly are you implying?" Barron stepped forward, his tone still devoid of arrogance yet carrying a weight that was impossible to ignore. "That as our professor, you should be able to solve the problem you gave me," he said simply. "Unless, of course, the goal was never to test mathematical ability, but to make a point at my expense." The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Lawson's hands clenched at his sides as his gaze flickered toward the whiteboard. He knew the problem he had written. He knew how difficult it was. And, just as the students did, he knew he could not solve it as quickly or as elegantly as the student he had tried to humiliate. Dean Whitaker folded his arms. "Well, Richard," he said deliberately, using the professor's first name, "it seems Mr. Trump has issued a rather fair request." Dr. Lawson's face burned with frustration. He glanced around the room, feeling the weight of the students' stares pressing down on him. He could not solve the problem. Not in real time. Not without preparation. And certainly not under the scrutiny of his own class. The professor's pride warred with his pragmatism. Finally, he took a slow breath and set the marker down on the desk. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "This entire display is nothing but an attempt to undermine my authority." Barron didn't move. "No, Professor," he said, his voice steady. "This is about the principle you've been lecturing us on, that knowledge, not status or background, should determine success." A murmur of agreement spread through the students. A few even clapped quietly, as if unsure whether it was appropriate, but unable to resist showing support. Dean Whitaker let out a slow exhale. "Richard," he said carefully, Perhaps it's time we reconsider how we approach these discussions in the classroom. Dr. Lawson's eyes flickered toward him, frustration flashing in his gaze. You're siding with him? The dean's expression remained neutral. I'm siding with academic integrity, he said simply. For the first time since the lecture had begun, Dr. Lawson had no response. Sensing that pushing further would only inflame the situation, Barron took a step back and gestured toward the whiteboard. At the end of the day, Professor, this isn't about politics. It's about education. And I'd rather spend our class time discussing the beauty of mathematics instead of personal ideologies. The professor said nothing. His jaw clenched. He turned on his heel and walked toward the exit. As the door closed behind him, the students remained silent for a long moment. Then, one by one, they began to clap, not out of disrespect, not out of defiance, but because, for the first time in a long time, they had just witnessed a lesson that truly mattered. Emily Carter hesitantly raised her hand. So, are we still going to learn calculus today? A ripple of laughter swept through the hall, breaking the tension like shattered glass. Even Dean Whittaker let out an amused huff. Barron turned toward the whiteboard. I suppose that depends, he said. Would anyone like me to walk through the second approach again? A few students immediately nodded. Others, hesitant at first, slowly leaned forward, their interest outweighing the lingering tension. Jacob Lee, watching with silent admiration, finally spoke up. Yeah. Actually, that would help a lot. Barron nodded, picking up the marker once again. All right, he said. Let's take it from the beginning. With the ease of someone who wasn't just skilled in mathematics but who also possessed a rare ability to make complex ideas accessible, Barron broke the equation down step by step. He paused to answer questions, ensuring that even those who had struggled with calculus before could follow along. Emily, who had always found math intimidating, nodded unconsciously as she scribbled down notes furiously. Jacob, who had spent years feeling as though he had to prove himself, felt something stir within him, a spark of confidence he had never quite grasped before. By the time Barron wrote the final solution, the atmosphere in the lecture hall had transformed. Several students, once passive listeners, were now actively engaged, asking questions, debating alternative methods, even daring to share their own insights. At the back of the room, Dean Whittaker observed in quiet fascination. He had spent years in academia, had seen countless debates and intellectual battles. But this was something different. This wasn't just a student proving his intelligence. It was a shift, a moment of reckoning. Then, as Barron stepped back from the board, a round of applause erupted. Unlike the hesitant, uncertain claps from earlier, this was genuine, an enthusiastic appreciation for what had just transpired. Barron simply nodded in acknowledgement, setting the marker down. Before anyone could speak again, the doors to the lecture hall swung open. Dr. Lawson had returned. The applause died instantly, the charged energy in the room snapping back into tension as every pair of eyes turned toward the professor. He stood in the doorway, his posture stiff, his jaw tight, his gaze sweeping over the students before landing on Barron. For a moment, it seemed as though he might lash out. But then, unexpectedly, he stepped inside. His movements guarded but not openly hostile. Dean Whittaker, Lawson said. His voice clipped. A word. The dean, who had been watching him carefully, gave a small nod and stepped aside with him. The two moved toward the corner of the room, their voices hushed as they spoke in private. Meanwhile, the students whispered among themselves. What do you think he's going to do? Emily murmured to Jacob. No idea. Jacob replied, eyes locked on the professor. But whatever it is, he looks like he's barely holding it together. Barron, still standing at the front, remained calm, his hands resting lightly on the podium as if he were the one in control now. He didn't move, didn't react, just waited. Finally, after a tense minute, Dean Whittaker stepped forward and cleared his throat. Instantly, The murmurs ceased. "Dr. Lawson and I have spoken," the dean announced, his tone unreadable. "And I believe it would be beneficial for the students if this class resumed its intended purpose." He let the words settle before adding, "That is, of course, if Mr. Trump would be willing to assist his peers in continuing today's lesson." A collective breath was held. Then Barron nodded. "I'd be happy to." A few students exchanged surprised glances. Even those who had been indifferent to the conflict now realized something significant had just taken place. Dr. Lawson, standing rigidly to the side, exhaled sharply through his nose. His pride was clearly still wounded, but he was pragmatic enough to recognize a losing battle. His gaze flickered toward Barron. "Unreadable." "Very well," he said finally. "Continue." And with that, he stepped back, choosing silence over further resistance. For the first time in weeks, the class became what it was meant to be, a place of learning, of curiosity, of intellectual growth. But even as Barron resumed his explanations and students eagerly re-engaged, one undeniable truth settled over the room. Something had changed. This wasn't just about mathematics. It had never been. It was a battle over integrity, over merit, over the very nature of academia itself. And Barron Trump had won. The remainder of the class continued with a renewed energy, one that hadn't been present in a long time. Barron stood at the front, answering questions with patience and clarity. His command over the lecture hall now absolute. Even those who had previously been disengaged found themselves leaning in, intrigued not just by the mathematics but by the shift in authority that had unfolded before their eyes. Dr. Richard Lawson, once the uncontested leader of the room, now stood to the side, silent, observing as the very student he had attempted to discredit seamlessly guided his peers through the subject he had dismissed as too rigid for modern education. Dean Whitaker, arms crossed, watched everything unfold with careful interest. He had witnessed many conflicts in academia, debates that had torn faculties apart, battles over ideologies, but never had he seen an undergraduate shift the dynamics of an entire classroom with nothing but intellect and composure. And yet, here Barron was. As the session finally came to a close, a few students lingered, approaching Barron not just with questions about the material but to express their appreciation. Emily was one of the first. "I think this is the first time I've ever actually understood this material," she admitted, clutching her notebook. "It just clicked." Barron offered a small, genuine smile. "That's the goal." Beside her, Jacob nodded in agreement. "Yeah, man," he said. "I was ready to drop this class before today. But now, I actually want to stick with it." At those words, Dr. Lawson, who had been quietly packing his belongings, visibly stiffened. Barron, however, didn't acknowledge the tension. Instead, he met Jacob's gaze directly. "Good," he said. "Because mathematics isn't about who you are or where you come from. It's about understanding. And once you have that, nothing else matters." Jacob let the words sink in before nodding. "Thanks, man." More students trickled forward, eager to be part of whatever had just unfolded. But just as Barron was preparing to leave, a voice stopped him. "Mr. Trump." Dr. Lawson had finally spoken. The air in the room shifted as the remaining students turned their attention toward the professor. His tone was unreadable, but there was something different in his posture, his usual rigid confidence tempered by something more subdued. Barron met his gaze evenly. "Yes, Professor?" For a long moment, Lawson studied him. His jaw tensed. His fingers curled slightly at his side as if wrestling with something unspoken. Finally, he exhaled. "You made your point today," he said. His voice measured. Barron didn't respond, allowing him to continue. "You're clearly gifted," Lawson admitted, though the words seemed difficult for him to say. "And I can see that the students respect you." A few students exchanged glances, uncertain where this was going. Lawson's eyes flickered toward the whiteboard, where the remnants of Barron's lesson still remained. "But don't mistake this for victory," he continued. Academia isn't just about knowledge. It's about influence, control. And today, you disrupted that balance. Barron remained still. Expression unreadable. Lawson exhaled sharply, picking up his bag. You may have won the room today, he said. But don't expect the system to welcome you for it. With that, he turned toward the exit. But just as he reached the door, Barron spoke. The system doesn't determine what we learn, he said evenly. We do. Dr. Lawson hesitated, then walked out without another word. A beat of silence passed. Then, from the back, Dean Whittaker let out a low chuckle. Well, he mused, I don't believe I've ever seen Richard Lawson leave a room without having the last word before. A few students laughed. Barron simply shrugged. It's not about winning an argument, he said. It's about making sure the right discussion takes place. And with that, the lesson, both in mathematics and something far greater, came to an end.